Similar to Asia, Africa is one of the last really untouched places by the Europeans. For the most part, it had been just the magnitude of Africa and its essential impenetrability to Westerners. Hostile natives, disease, lack of technology had kept the Europeans from penetrating deep into the African interior up until about the 1870s. Yes, the Europeans had made a lot of contacts along the coast of Africa, and they had traded African ivory and African gold and African slaves that we've talked about before in abundance, but all of this by way of using resources from Africa itself. By the 1880s, the Europeans are going to want chunks of Africa for their own. They're going to want to move in and take these areas over, administer them, and mine them. Get those raw resources that industrialized modern Europe needs and extract them at whatever cost. The British again lead the way. The British are teaching everything. The British were in early in Africa. The British are going to have one of the most clearly developed plans, and they're going to have one of the most active imperialists on the ground. The British got in early. It was actually the French who dug the Suez Canal, but in many ways it was the British who financed it, and the British are going to move in and through economic means, take over virtual control of Egypt. This kind of economic indirect control is going to be much more the type of imperialism that we see in this new imperialism than the old style where you would actually move big parts of your population and literally displace the locals and take over and create a new England or a new France or a new Spain. Economic domination, political domination, all will be far more preferable to anything that would be a literal physical presence on the ground. And so Egypt and the Suez Canal become incredibly important to the British. For one, it ties Britain to the gem of its empire, India. India is a huge moneymaker for Britain, and Britain is investing vastly in India as well. So the Suez Canal shortening the trip by half between the home island and its colonial gem makes all the difference. The British colonizer of Africa, and really the guy that we associate with European colonialism in Africa, is Cecil Rhodes, and the figure of our cartoon here. Rhodes moved into South Africa for health reasons, and then got very healthy, working with South African gold, and later really becomes famous for diamonds. He sets up the De Beers Diamond Company and becomes fantastically wealthy, and also an advocate of British imperial power. He wants to fly the British flag over all of South Africa, and he dreams, and again, as the cartoon demonstrates here, of a British Africa that runs the entire length from north to south, a Cairo to the Cape empire. And Rhodes is going to help set that up. Rhodes is going to displace not only local populations, but even some earlier settlers. By the late 1890s, this is going to actually draw the British government into a war, as Rhodes's influence is going to displace early Dutch settlers, the Dutch Boers in South Africa. They resist this, and the resulting Boer War is an expensive, nasty, sort of distant colonial affair that remains a thorn in the British side, but more importantly, threatens to drag the British into inter-European competitions. When the German Kaiser takes the side of the Dutch Boers, it looks like we might get a European war out of this distant imperial war, and so the British have to wrap it up. The empire is going to have that effect and is going to be a problem going forward because of these imperial rivalries and the costs that empire represents to the modern world. France, much more than in Asia, focuses on Africa, especially West Central Africa and the North African coast. Algeria becomes sort of the gem of the French African Empire. And France works very hard to multi-ethnicize, actually to isolate the native Algerians, to move them out of power and to bring in more direct French government, more direct French settlement, other settlers, and to literally displace the Algerian population. when we come to decolonization a couple chapters from now, remember this because it comes back to haunt the French. Germany is one of the latest comers to the imperial challenge, and they therefore get only small chunks of Africa, though, like we said with the Boer War, they become an antagonist and a definite threat at destabilizing the entire process. In fact, it's the Germans who upset Rhodes's plan of a Cairo to the Cape British Empire and railroad to match, as the Germans place themselves athwart that line on the eastern coast of Africa. Belgium is probably one of the most horrific stories that is associated with African settlement. The Congo River Basin was noted for being incredibly resource rich. Ivory and gold and other resources that were there were wanted by all the Europeans. And in sort of a multinational effort, the Europeans agreed to share these, to put them under an international corporation that would be headed by, that would be overseen by Leopold II, the King of Belgium. It wound up being just a shadow company, really, so that Leopold and Belgium could extract massive wealth from this Congo basin. The empire, in this case, Belgian Congo, is 10 times the size of the home country. And the practices, the torture, the kind of horrible imperial colonial practices that the Belgians did become sort of a watchword for anti-colonial efforts to show how dehumanizing, how appalling this sort of behavior can be, and how it hurts even those colonizers who are involved with it, how it compromises them. If you want to see a great story on this, read Joseph Conrad's short novel, Heart of Darkness, where he takes this very thing on. Finally, the one African success story, and this is a qualified one, is the country of Ethiopia. The Italians had been trying to acquire the territories on the western bank of the Red Sea. They had moved themselves into Somalia, into Eritrea, and they attempted to colonize Ethiopia as well. The king of Ethiopia was fairly clever, had used his wealth and resources to acquire some modern artillery, some modern European weapons, and he is able to, in a tremendous upset, actually drive the Italians back and prevent colonization of his country at that time. Again, put a bookmark on this, because when we get to the late 1930s and fascism and Benito Mussolini and Italian ideas of greatness and growth, they're going to revisit Ethiopia and bring them a special punishment because of the defiance that Ethiopia had here. But between Asia and Africa, these are the two big uncolonized regions of the world by 1870. By 1900, they are almost totally spoken for by European powers. In Africa in particular, you go from almost zero, about 10% of Africa is under control of the Europeans, to by 1900, over 90% of African territory is under control by the Europeans. This kind of race for power and resources and wealth is naturally going to generate all kinds of competition, and it's going to set the stage for World War I in about 2 chapters.